Hi everyone, so today we're going to be looking at homeostasis and so we're looking at the regulation of different processes in the body, so how your body will regulate temperature, blood glucose and water, as well as the stimulus response model and feedback loops associated with homeostasis. So let's get started. So what is homeostasis? Well, the definition that I want you to know is that it is the process that maintains a relatively stable internal environment of an organism so that it can function properly. The examples that we're going to look at are body temperature, blood glucose, and water balance. So why do we need to maintain a stable environment? Well, animals, plants, and cells in general need specific conditions to survive. And so there is a set range of parameters that organisms can tolerate. Outside of this range, organisms can malfunction or even die. So if we look at this graph, not quite a graph, but this diagram over here, we know that the optimal temperature for humans is about 37 degrees. So we've got a normal range around here. Below this, we have hypothermia. So when you get too cold, if your body temperature gets to about 28 degrees, that's very low and you can even die at this point. Above this 37 degrees, which is our optimal temperature, we have hyperthermia. So this is when you are too hot. So your body can get a little bit hotter when you're exercising or if you have a fever. But if you get to about 42 degrees, you can die from being this hot as well. So our body really does have a very small range that it works best at. Outside of this range, your body can start to malfunction, and then very far outside of this range, your body can even die. And this is the same for plants and other animals. So we said that homeostasis is about maintaining a relatively stable internal environment. So I just want to quickly go over the difference between an internal environment and external environment. So your internal environment is your cells within an organism. It's your internal body temperature, it's your blood glucose levels, your fluid levels, iron concentration in the blood, oxygen levels in the blood, fluids surrounding the brain. So it's your internal environment, things that are happening within your body or within an organism's body. Your external environment is things like temperature, it's levels of oxygen or other gases in the air, it's the altitude or exposure to chemicals. So I want you to be able to distinguish between the internal environment and external environment. So we are going to use a stimulus response model, which you can see down here, to explain how organisms can maintain their internal environment. So we have a stimulus, receptor, modulator, effector, and response. So starting with the stimulus, this is a change in the internal or external environment. So for example, you're eating food or you're exercising, there is a rain, or you're dehydrated, something that changes. So your receptors detect the change in the internal or external environment, and they're able to create or convert a chemical or electrical signal to be transmitted. So your chemical signals are your hormones and your electrical signals are your nervous system. And so if you think back to when we looked at the endocrine system, we looked at a lot of different hormones and how they are long distance communication for your body. And so this message is then communicated to the modulator, which is the next step in the stimulus response model. But before we get there, I just wanted you to be aware of some different types of receptors. You don't need to remember each different type, but just understand that we do have different types of receptors. So we have thermoreceptors, and they detect changes in temperature, because thermo means heat. We have nociceptors, I can't quite say that word, but they detect painful stimuli. You have baroreceptors, which detect change in pressure, so things like your blood pressure. Chemoreceptors detect change in chemical concentrations, and photoreceptors detect change in light. There are other different types of receptors which you can look at over here, and the certain stimuli that they would detect, as well as where they are found. So next we have the modulator, and the message from the receptor is sent here to the modulator. And the modulator is able to compare this information that it receives from the receptor with our normal range of conditions, or whatever the normal range of conditions is for that organism. And if the modulator detects that this message detected by the receptor is outside the normal range, it will then send another signal to the effector, and this is to bring back the body or the organism to that normal range of conditions. For the most part, the modulator is the brain, but it can also be specific types of cells or specific tissues, or a different organ, but for the most part it is the brain. An example of how a modulator works is that we have the thermoreceptors, and that detects a temperature of 40 degrees. This message is sent to the brain, so specifically the hypothalamus, which compares it to the normal range of temperature, which is 36 to 37 degrees in humans. The brain then sends a signal to your sweat glands, and then you move on down the stimulus response model. So once the modulator has detected that this signal shows that the conditions are outside of our normal range, it's going to send a signal to an effector. So this can be a molecule, a cell, a tissue, an organ, and essentially the effector responds to the signal. It then initiates a response to bring back the body or the organism to a normal range. The example here, continuing on from the last slide, is when you exceed the normal body temperature, your sweat glands, which is your effector, receive the signal and produce sweat to cool down the body. And so producing sweat would be the response. So the response is a change produced by the effector to counteract the stimulus. Counteracting the stimulus is an important part because we know that the condition that the body is in right now is outside of that normal range. And so this is brought on by the stimulus. So in the example, the stimulus was that we were outside the normal temperature range. We were too hot. So our body is going to try to do something to counteract that stimulus, to make our body go in the opposite direction. And sweating is the response that it produces. This cools us down, counteracting the stimulus of our body being too hot. And so we are brought back to homeostasis. Our body is brought back to a normal range, and we can maintain that stable internal environment. So this is just a summary of the stimulus response model and the example that we went through. So our stimulus is increased temperature. Our thermoreceptors pick this up. This signal is sent to the hypothalamus in the brain, which is our modulator. It sends a signal to our effectors, which is sweat glands, which produce a response, such as sweating, and this cools us down. And so this is considered negative feedback because it is counteracting the stimulus. And we're going to go into the negative feedback loop in just a moment. But this stimulus response model is something that you need to know. You need to know that in order to explain how homeostasis works, you can use a stimulus, receptor, modulator, effector, and response, which counteracts the stimulus. I'd like you to take just a moment now to use this stimulus response model and write out the stimulus, receptor, modulator, and effector and response in the scenario of you being too cold. So what's the stimulus? What detects it? What compares it to the normal range? What produces the response? And what is the response? And then answer the question, what would happen if we cannot maintain homeostasis in this scenario? And then we'll go over this in class. So let's have a look at feedback loops. And so the stimulus response model can either illustrate a negative feedback loop or a positive feedback loop. We've been looking mostly at negative feedback loops. And so this is when a response counteracts the stimulus. A positive feedback loop, however, is a response that reinforces the stimulus. So let's have a look at some of these. Right, so we were looking at the example of body temperature. This is you in the middle. When your body temperature increases, your body will produce a response such as sweating, which counteracts that stimulus and brings your body temperature back down. The same way, if your body temperature decreases, your body will produce a response such as shivering, counteracting that stimulus and increasing your body temperature, bringing you back to a normal range. So this is negative feedback because we are producing a response in the opposite direction of the stimulus. We're counteracting the stimulus. Positive feedback is different, and this is not about really maintaining homeostasis, and positive feedback doesn't happen very often. A common example is during childbirth. So the stimulus is over here. So the head of the baby pushes down against the cervix. So this is right before a woman is about to give birth. The nerve impulses from the cervix are transmitted to the brain, which is our modulator. The brain stimulates the pituitary gland to secrete oxytocin. And so this is one of the hormones that I said that I wanted you to know. Oxytocin is carried through the bloodstream to the uterus, and then oxytocin stimulates uterine contractions and pushes the baby further down towards the cervix. And the baby's head pushes up against the cervix, and we keep getting this loop. So in a positive feedback loop, the baby pushing down on the cervix produces a response of oxytocin being released, which causes more contractions and more pushing down towards the cervix. So we are reinforcing the stimulus. We want this stimulus to continue to happen. And this is important in this scenario, such as childbirth, because we want this baby to be born. If we were counteracting this stimulus, that would mean that the baby isn't being pushed out of the cervix. So in some cases, we have to have positive feedback, and that is pushing our body further outside of its normal range. But after this baby has been born, your body will stop obviously producing oxytocin because there's nothing pushing down on the cervix, and your body will return back to homeostasis, and so you're maintaining that internal stable environment. I think this is a good idea to remember this positive feedback example. There aren't a lot of positive feedback examples. This is the most common one. So I would remember this example, and then you have a lot of other examples that you would know for negative feedback, and we're going to go through a few of them through this topic. And here we have just a simple summary of the negative feedback loop and the positive feedback loop using that stimulus response model. Important to note that in the negative feedback loop, we are counteracting the stimulus, but in the positive feedback loop, we are strengthening or reinforcing the stimulus. All right, and that is all for homeostasis. I'm going to leave you with this meme from the Amoeba Sisters. Please write down any questions that you may have and bring them to class, and I will see you then.